Diagnosing problems that you're having with your seams can be kind of daunting at some time. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the most common problems that you're going to see when trying to figure out what's going wrong with your machine. A lot of times this will happen really quickly. You'll be sewing along, everything will be fine. Then you'll sit back down to your machine and everything seems to be haywire. The very first thing we're going to do is sew a regular straight stitch seam. And if we look really closely, you'll actually be able to see, I have yellow on the bottom, you'll be able to see the yellow peeking up to the top. It's not huge loops, but if you look at it from this angle, you can see your top thread is just straight along the top. If we turn our fabric over, you'll see it looks okay, but it's kind of loose. I'm not sure if that would even be acceptable as a good seam. What happens when our bobbin thread is really loose and our bobbin thread is peeking up to the top side of the fabric? That's one of two things. Either your top thread, the one that comes from your spool, is too tight, or your bobbin thread is too loose. Easiest thing to do is to feel of your tensions. So we'll start with the top thread. So with our top thread, what we're going to do is we're going to grab our thread here, and I'm going to hold it off to the left-hand side. With the presser foot in the lifted position, if I pull on my thread, it should pull nice and free and easy. If you notice, the needle is not flexing at all. If I lower my presser foot, what happens is when the presser foot goes down, your tension discs that are on the inside of the top of the machine, some of them are on the front of the machine, but with the presser foot in the down position, your tension discs are going to be closed. So they're going to start to apply the pressure to your thread. Now the upper thread tension has to be considerably stronger than the bobbin thread, because the bobbin thread is only paying out how much thread the stitch length is set to. The top thread has to go down through however many thicknesses of fabric, has to go around the whole bobbin and bobbin case, and then has to be pulled back up through all of that, and the take-up lever is going, the eye that goes up and down, is going to pull against the tension assembly so that the knot with the regulation of the upper thread tension is supposed to meet in the middle of the fabric. That's your strongest seam. So if I pull on this thread now, look at how much the needle is flexing. I mean, it's flexing a lot. So that's telling me that, that your upper thread tension is functioning correctly. If your needle did not flex like that and it pulled out just as easy as when the presser foot was in the raised position, looking like that, then what that's telling you is you may have some debris caught in between the upper thread tension discs, or your thread is not all the way in between the thread tension discs. So if that's the case, down and it's not flexing, then what you want to do is clip your thread up here at the spool, raise the presser foot, and then pull your thread out of the machine, and then rethread your machine, making sure to hold on to the top thread where it goes into the first thread guide, right where it comes off of the spool, to add some tension to the thread while you drag the thread all the way through, all the way down to the needle bar thread guide. Once you get it through the needle bar thread guide, then you can turn loose of your top thread, and then you can thread your needle. And then you will want to check it again. Lower your presser foot, see if it flexes the needle. If it flexes the needle, you're good to go. Now then what we have to do is we have to check our bobbin thread. Our bobbin thread should have a light tension. And right now I'm pulling on our bobbin thread. I have absolutely zero tension on my bobbin thread. There's none there at all. That's telling me that my bobbin thread is likely not in the tension on my bobbin case. Now, since this is a drop-in bobbin, I can look down in there and I can tell that my thread is coming out the back here. So that's telling me it's not in the thread tension. If it's in the thread tension, my bobbin thread would be coming over the top of the bobbin on a drop-in bobbin system. If you have one of the machines that the bobbin case and bobbin go in from the front down below the accessory tray, or in from the left end, it'll still be the same way. When you pull on this thread and you feel zero tension, that means that either the bobbin thread is not in the bobbin thread tension, or there's some debris caught between the tension spring and the body of the bobbin case. And what that does is that holds that spring open, thereby giving you a zero tension. That will allow the top thread to win the tug of war, if you will, and pull the thread up above the fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our bobbin out of our machine, and on a drop-in bobbin, you want to make sure you pull the thread, and the bobbin itself should be turning counterclockwise, and which it is. So I'm going to make sure, just like I held my thread up here, to make sure that my thread makes it into every place that it's supposed to on its way down to the needle. I'm going to do the same thing with my bobbin. I'm going to put my finger on my bobbin. I'm going to pull it into and around. There's little arrows on most of these machines. There's one right there. I'm going to hold that thread, put that on, and then trim my thread. So now we're going to sew another seam right next to the first seam. Okay, so now you'll be able to see the top thread, which is a dark blue, just barely. And if you turn it over, you will just barely be able to see the bobbin thread, the yellow bobbin thread, through the material. It's impossible to hide the knot from both sides. You're always going to see the yellow unless you make it so your upper thread tension so loose that the bobbin thread pulls it down, or vice versa to pull the bobbin thread up. Remember, this seam was a zero tension, and see how the thread came to the top, but it wasn't like huge loops or anything. But if we hold this at a little bit of an angle, you'll be able to see the profile difference between that seam and that seam. This seam, that's coming up. If you were to grab that top thread on this first seam, you'd be able to pull it straight out. On this seam, it's locked in the middle, which your strongest seam is where the top thread and the bobbin thread cross over each other in the middle of the fabric. That is your strongest seam. You will not be able to pull this out. So if the seam were to break right here, you might lose a couple of stitches that way and a couple of stitches that way, but that'll be it. It will tie itself. That's why they call this a lock stitch. That's the idea is you see your two seams. So we're going to try the same stitch, straight stitch, but we're going to show you a different type of problem. So if we look at the bottom of that, it didn't even grab my bobbin thread, but look at all the big loops on the bottom. That is not the type of seam we want. That won't hold much together. So what we're going to do is we're, again, going to diagnose our seam. Since it's looping on the bottom, the tip here is thread looping on the bottom is virtually always the upper thread. Thread looping on the top is virtually always the bobbin thread. It's opposite what you would normally think. So if you notice our top thread, the stitch looks really loose and sloppy. The bobbin side, it was so loose that it wouldn't even capture the stitch. So it wouldn't capture the bobbin thread. But you see how big these loops are. So what we're going to do first, since it's probably the top thread, we're going to take our needle thread and we're going to pull on our needle thread. if you notice, our needle is not moving at all. I mean, it's not moving at all, and it feels just like when the presser foot is lifted. Remember, the upper thread tension discs open when you thread your machine. That's with the presser foot lifted. Thread your machine so that you can get the thread down in between the tension discs easily. That's one of the reasons why the tension discs open up, is so that you can get the thread in there easily. The other reason is so that you can pull your fabric out nice and easily. So because we have zero tension, more than likely I'm not in between the thread tension discs. So what we're going to do is we're going to raise our presser foot. We're going to rethread our machine. And notice I am holding my thread to make sure that I get the upper thread in everywhere it's supposed to get to. And then we'll thread our needle. So now we're going to try the same thing. We're going to lower our presser foot. And now we're going to pull on our thread. And if you notice, you can see the needle is really flexing. That's what it's supposed to do. So now let's try our seam all over again. And now look how perfect our seam is there. So we were able to diagnose which problem it was, having somewhat of a hint that the loops on the bottom side of the fabric are almost always the top thread, and the loops on the top side of the fabric are almost always the bobbin thread. So here's another common problem that I run into. A lot of times you might get a thread rat's nest that happens underneath the needle plate, and you have to take your needle plate off and your bobbin case out so that you can clean all of that mess out from underneath there. And you put it all back together, and this is what happens. It will not sew. It's not moving the thread at all. There's no stitch. And if I raise this, I can't, it's all stuck underneath there. Look at all of that. It's stuck. It's not going to complete a stitch. Well, if you pull your bobbin and bobbin case out of your machine, sometimes what happens is your bobbin case may not be setting in there correctly. If it's not setting in there correctly, the position bracket, the part that holds the bobbin case in place so the thread can go all the way around the bobbin case and complete the stitch, might be hung up, might be in a wrong position. So what you have to do is you have to take your needle plate off, and lo and behold, I'm looking, and on this bobbin case, this line right here has to be straight across. So this is not in position, and so my thread is captured right on this little point right here, which is part of the position bracket. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back correct like it's supposed to be, and you may have to do this. So if you have to take your bobbin case out, make sure when you take your needle plate off that you take a picture of your bobbin case of how if it's working properly. Take a picture of your bobbin case so you have that picture. It's more than likely in your instruction manual as well, but you want to make sure that you're able to put that bobbin case back in your machine correctly. Some of these machines will have two little red or white dots that are supposed to line up, so it's a visual for you. This one, the main visual here, is this line has to be horizontal. You can have this same problem with the 15 class bobbin cases or the metal bobbin cases. If they're not installed correctly, you will have the same problem. You want to remove the bobbin and bobbin case, look at a picture of what it's supposed to look like when it's put back in place, and that way you won't make the same mistake and cause you some grief trying to sew a piece of fabric. So we're going to put our needle plate back on. We're going to drop our bobbin back in, and remember, on drop-in bobbins, your bobbin should be turning counterclockwise, which mine is. Put my finger on the bobbin, pull it into the tension assembly, and then we're going to do another seam right next to our really nasty looking seam there where it was all hung up. And we made it a whole lot further this time. Look at that. And now we have a perfect seam. Top and bottom look perfect. You can see a little bit of the top thread on the bottom side and a little bit of the bobbin thread on the top side. So here's one of our bobbin cases that has a few problems. So if you notice right there, that's up pretty chewed up. So usually that is where the needle strays to the side one way or the other. It's going to nick it over there, or you see over here there's holes punched in there, and it's got a pretty bad scar here, and even right here. Remember, the thread has to go all the way around this bobbin and bobbin case. So when it starts to come around any of these scars, it's going to catch on the bobbin case, just like if your bobbin case was not installed correctly. It's going to catch on those. The reason you get a lot of these problems over on this side of the bobbin is because your upper thread is not threaded correctly. Checking your upper thread is actually pretty easy. You simply lower the presser foot and pull on your thread coming out of the needle. If you have a lot of tension, it's flexing the needle, then your upper thread is okay. But if it's not, it can grab big loops and then will cause this kind of damage. The other thing that will cause this kind of damage, these are all from the needle, by the way. These scars are all from the needle. That means this bobbin case, instead of setting in there correct, just remember this line being horizontal to the front of the presser foot, this has to be over here in order for the needle to do that kind of damage, or even all the way around here. That means this bobbin case has been yanked out of its position bracket. The part that's supposed to hold this bobbin case in place, it's being yanked out of the way. So the other thing that can cause this bobbin case to spin all the way around, if the take-up lever does not have the thread in it. And a lot of people will just pull the thread through, and sometimes the little latch that is latching the thread into the top of the take-up lever doesn't actually allow the thread to make it all the way in there. If that happens the first time the take-up lever goes down, it comes back up, it flips that thread off, and if it flips that thread off, there is the big loop that goes around the bobbin case, but then there is no take-up lever to take up that excess loop of thread. So what happens is the needle goes down, that grabs a second loop, the hook will grab a second loop. When it grabs that second loop, it's going to start tugging on this, and before you can stop, it's grabbed 4 or 5 loops, and it's jerked your bobbin case from its original position all the way around, and your needle has punched holes in your bobbin case. If that's the case, you need to get a new bobbin case. That is a common problem I see. A lot of bobbin cases I can repair, but this one is way too damaged to repair. It has to have a new bobbin case. So there's one other problem that you can have, and it's kind of like having your bobbin case not installed correctly. It'll kind of feel that same way. You'll wind up with a similar result on the back side of your fabric. So we're going to make our straight stitch seam. And you see, it's not wanting to do anything. It's not wanting to sew. So what happens is the take-up lever is not pulling up the excess loop of thread that has gone around our bobbin and bobbin case. If that's the case, the loop's going to the hook underneath is going to grab 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 loops, and that's what it's going to look like. So it's similar to having your bobbin case not installed correctly. However, you won't be able to get a stitch at all. You won't see big loops. You won't see any of that kind of stuff. It just will not sew at all. On the bobbin thread, we're going to run through the same thing. We're going to check our bobbin thread. So I'm going to pull a little bit of bobbin thread. I have a very light tension. That's what I'm supposed to have. I pull on my top thread tension with the presser foot down. I have my tension. You see the needle's flexing. I do have tension. However, our take-up lever is not threaded, and so it's not pulling up the excess loop. So first thing you want to do is raise your presser foot, clip your thread, pull that out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to rethread our machine. And I'm holding my thread to make sure I add tension, to make sure I get my thread all the way into the take-up lever. That is super important. We're going to do our seam. And here we have a great seam. We can see the yellow thread just barely visible from the top side of the fabric. Our yellow thread is our bobbin thread. And if we flip this over, we can see some of the blue thread just barely visible, and that's our top thread. That's our needle thread. So we have a perfect seam. Both threads are meeting in the middle. So remember, you can't hide the bobbin thread from the top and at the same time hide the top thread from the bobbin side of the fabric. It's impossible to do unless you have a really thick piece of fabric. If you have a thick piece of fabric, it's possible to get that to hide in there. Well, I hope that helps some of you guys, and if you did get something out of it, please like the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button, and I'll try to keep making more of these, give you hints and tips and tricks about your sewing machines. Troubleshooting your sewing machine can be easy. You just have to know a few basic steps, and you'll be able to do that yourself at 11 o'clock at night, and that'll keep you from having the wine, stuff like that, and the chocolate. Thanks again for watching.